Hello and welcome to Forbidden Talk, the discursive show exploring social sensitive issues in the Middle East. Today we'll be tackling the deeply complex taboo topic of female sexuality in the Middle East. How do Middle Eastern women strive for sexual freedom within the confines of a patriarchal system that seems so set upon restricting her independence? Or have we got this perception wrong? Judging from Western eyes, it would be very easy to label the Arab woman as the oppressed victim. However, is this always the case? In this episode, we'll be looking beneath the covers of the hidden, intimate world of the Middle East and draw upon reality versus perceptions. Furthermore, we'll be discussing the sexual exploitation that is currently happening to women and children in certain parts of the region and its consequences. At this point, I'd like to introduce my studio guests, Shireen El-Feki, writer, broadcaster and academic, and author of Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, and Dr. Valeria Cetorelli, research officer at the Middle East Centre at London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
But before we move on, let's take a look at this brief report.
The Arab world is often criticised by the West for its lack of sexual tolerance. However, this wasn't always the case. Throughout history, Islam possessed a relatively open attitude to sex, with many religious scholars providing sex advice in the medieval period. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the 11th century philosopher, wrote prolifically about the importance of the female orgasm. Yet in recent decades, with rise of Islamic fundamentalism, societies across the Arab region have become far less comfortable in expressing their sexuality. Sex is still caught up in shame, especially for women, which makes it a powerful weapon of social and political control. In Arab society, the only legitimate avenue for sexual and reproductive life is within the confines of marriage. There is severe stigma attached to premarital sex, and as such, relationships are often hidden. With families, however, often turning a blind eye to their sons engaging in premarital sex, this is not the case for women. Female virginity is highly prized in the region and honour killings still exist. Instead of women's sexuality being celebrated, they are often victimised by it. At least 90% of married Egyptian women between the ages of 15 and 49 have undergone FGM, female genital mutilation. In Tunisia, often seen as a liberal light in the region, 47.2% of women have suffered domestic violence. In Egypt, 99.3% of women have experienced sexual harassment. Furthermore, sexual exploitation and slavery are a growing issue for Syrian and Palestinian family refugees as a means to provide food and shelter for their families. With female sexuality being so heavily monitored in the Middle East, can women ever gain sexual equality in the region?
Shireen, I'd love to start with you. You've said that if you really want to know people, you start by looking inside their bedrooms. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, in researching my book, Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, I spent 5 years traveling across the region talking to people about sex. Now, I know this is either going to sound like a dream job or a rather dubious occupation, but the reason I looked at sexuality is just for this reason, because what is happening outside the bedroom in terms of politics and economics and religion and relations between gender and generations is reflected in relations inside the bedroom, in sexual life. But what's also very interesting is what happens in sexual life, in private life, also feeds into what is happening in the bigger public space. So the intimate and the public, the sexual and the political, are intimately entwined across the Arab region.
And Valeria, what are the biggest misconceptions about females and their sexuality in the Middle East, do you think?
Well, I think probably the biggest misconception is to see women in the Middle East as a homogeneous group. I really think there is a lot of variation within countries and between countries. So obviously women, for example, in Tunisia do not face the same legal and cultural barriers in terms of their sexuality as women, for example, in Saudi Arabia. But we also see a lot of variation in experiences within countries. So, for example, highly educated women in urban areas often experience sexuality differently from a woman living in a more traditional rural areas. So I think it's really important to start by acknowledging this variety of experiences. So women in the Middle East are not all the same, exactly like women in the West are not all the same.
Yeah, we definitely can't generalize. But you spoke to a range of Arab women about sex. How was this received? What were the reactions?
Well, because sex is such a taboo subject, one would think that there would be silence and a real reluctance to talk. My problem wasn't getting women, and men as well, to talk about sex. It was getting them to stop talking about sex. Because the reality is that we as Arabs across the region are speaking about sex all the time. Women are speaking with women, men are talking with men. The difficulty becomes when you bring men and women together, then the silence and the reticence slips in. And then when you try to take this discussion about sex into the public domain. And so we have censorship in the media in many countries. We have virtually no sexuality education in schools. Our laws, which Valeria mentioned, are quite repressive and controlling when it comes to sex, reflect that discomfort, for instance. It's very difficult to do research in many cases because of getting official permissions and the like. And yet these discussions are happening تحت الترابيزة, beneath the table. The challenge we have in the Arab region is to bring these conversations from private whispers into public debate, because that's where they need to be, because we have many, many problems which need resolution and they need a more open discussion.
Mm-hmm. Valeria, what are the obstacles for women in the Middle East that impose on their sexual freedom? So what are the structures in place that perhaps limit their freedom?
Well, I think in patriarchal societies in general, not just in the Middle East, there is a lot of social pressure on women to conform to what is expected from them. So, for example, in the Middle East, women are expected not to have sex until their marriage. And once married, women are under social pressure to bear children as soon as possible. So those who do not conform to these social norms are often seen as dishonoring not only themselves, but their whole families. And like, we should remember these are like communal cultures where there is like relatively limited scope for personal choice if this choice in some way is considered as illicit or inappropriate by the community. Obviously, there are also economic obstacles. We can think that, for example, women who do not work outside their home may be more dependent on their families, and in particular on their male relatives. And so they might be less free in terms of their choices than women who are economically independent.
Right. Okay. And this marriage setup, this thing called marriage, can we talk about the structure in the Arab world? Because I think in the West, sometimes you think, well, there's two individuals getting together and forming a life together, but that's not always the case.
Absolutely. So marriage is the key milestone, really, in one's progression to adulthood. In my book, this is the citadel. I talk about sex within marriage. It's the only socially accepted context, and everything else is haram, forbidden, it's ayib, it's shameful. So marriage is very important, because if you don't get married, as a man or as a woman, it's very difficult to move out of your parents' place. You really have difficulty having sex, quite frankly. I mean, it's quite furtive. It's something that is not openly acknowledged. You can't really start a family. It's not accepted. All the milestones of adulthood are simply unachievable. You enter into this state of what is effectively prolonged adolescence. Now, in terms of marriage, in Islam, it's very interesting. We have many, many different types of Islamically accepted marriage. So, for instance, the Shia, in Shia Islam, there is a form of marriage called mut'a, pleasure marriage, and effectively this allows two individuals to come together for a prescribed period of time, effectively to be intimate, and then they can divorce, no strings attached. We have misyar marriage, which is in some Sunni communities, in which husbands and wives can come together together, but live in separate households, for example. We have other forms of marriage, so-called travelers' marriages, and of course we have the infamous orfi marriage, so-called customary marriage, which is essentially, today, two young people who want to have a relationship. They either can't afford to get married or their parents don't accept the marriage. Therefore, they are trying to give effectively some Islamic cover to what is dating, essentially. At the end of the day, though, and it's very interesting what survey data and polling show us across the Arab region, where we have asked young people about their attitudes towards these alternative forms of marriage. Now, the central problem about the full bells and whistles, big white wedding marriage is that it is increasingly unattainable in many parts of the region because it is just so expensive. And men are expected to bear the vast majority of the costs of marriage, men and their families, and we have double-digit unemployment in many of our countries, which is one of the major drivers of the Arab uprisings of 2011. And so these men can't afford this particular milestone of official marriage. So, but when you ask young people, do you think maybe these informal types of marriage would be a more acceptable and logical solution to this marriage dilemma? They will tell you publicly anyway, absolutely not. This is not a lifestyle choice for us. This is a last resort. What we really want is to get to the real thing, really socially sanctioned, religiously approved, registered with a state marriage, because then we can get on with our lives.
So there is a casual dating scene?
Absolutely. And again, as Valeria said, it does rather depend on your class and your location, for instance. But clearly anyone who's, anyone, for example, you, if you've been to downtown Cairo or, the fashionable parts of our capitals across the Arab region, of course you see young people, men and women coming together. They have to do it less overtly in many cases, but they manage it all the same. And this is coming back to one of the central points, this perception of Arab women as being oppressed and repressed. It's very true, as Valeria said, there are a vast range of legal and cultural and social family controls on women, yet at the end of the day, they do rather find their way and get what they want. My Egyptian grandmother had a proverb for this. She said that a clever woman can spin yarn with a donkey's thigh bone. And what she meant by that is that women find a way of managing with the tools at hand. They did in my grandmother's day, they have done since time immemorial, and they are doing so now.
Okay. Wise words from the grandmother. I'd like to now welcome over the phone from Sweden, Dr. David Ghanem, an independent scholar originally from Iraq. He is the author of Gender and Violence in the Middle East. Dr. Ghanem, you've stated in your book that sexually frustrated people are also politically violent. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Hello, Anna. Greetings to you and to your guest. Gender segregation and criminalization of love and sex produce two contradictory outcomes. On the one hand, it is sexual fixation and obsession in society, and on the other hand, a process of desexualization by producing the virgins, asexual females. So when this sexual obsession is unmet, there is sexual frustration. Now we come to, that is premarital life. When it comes to marriage, and in the Middle East, marriage is synonym to sexuality. I mean, in the sense that it is the only legitimate way to engage in sex. Yet the damage has already been done by socializing women to be virgin and asexual, and also by distorting the meaning of sexuality. On the other hand, when it comes to family structure in marriage, it is authoritarian and lacking intimacy. And there are separate activities for the husbands and the wife, men and women. Marital sexuality is based on obedience, and sex is considered as a duty. And therefore, sexual and emotional frustration continue despite sex in marriage. This frustration is leading to more violence in marital life, and also increasing the propensity toward violence and condoning of violence in society. It is like leading to normalization of violence in society. So domestic violence is taken to public domain and vice versa. Violence become the natural outcome in a society where love and sexuality and gender mixings are condemned and criminalized. So if you want a peaceful society, you need to celebrate love, humanize or rehumanize sexuality, and encourage gender mixing.
Dr. Ghanem, I'd love to, at this point, incorporate Shireen El-Feki. Do you agree on those points, the sexual life lacking intimacy?
I think it is true that there is a real problem in communication between husbands and wives. And certainly in my own research and as Dr. Ghanem has seen in his own work, there is a real discomfort between men and women. And in particular, women, I found, they would ask fantastic questions, really probing questions, frank questions, really sometimes very surprising questions about sexuality. And yet when we talk about the possibilities of perhaps spicing up relations in the bedroom, they would be very, very fearful of taking initiative because that they were afraid of being seen as bad women, as having had experience.
Absolutely.
And so there was a lot of pressure there. I need to point out also there was also pressure on men in marital relations, in that, again, because sex is so furtive, for many men, they actually have performance anxiety. This is their big break. They are waiting for marriage in large part because it gives them a legitimate route for sexuality. And so there was a lot of pressure on them to perform. So the wedding night, in many cases, becomes this really almost endurance test where a woman has to demonstrate her virginity, a man has to demonstrate his prowess. And the tension and the real lack of communication carries on outside of the bedroom in terms of problems. And I'm sure Dr. Ghanem has seen this, but when one looks at divorce statistics and the reason for divorce, which is escalating in some parts of the Arab region, particularly in the Gulf states, one sees that in many cases young couples are separating or breaking their relations because of sexual incompatibility. And it really comes to a lack of sexual communication. What I differ slightly to Dr. Ghanem's perspective on the role of sexual frustration. Many people have commented, for example, if one looks at the violence in Tahrir Square and on the streets of Egypt's major urban centers, your opening report talked about 99% of Egyptian women having experienced sexual harassment. And it has been posited by some commentators, it's because these young men cannot marry, and therefore they are sexually frustrated, and they are sort of pumped up with music videos and women wearing revealing clothing on the street, and therefore it's pouring out into sexual violence. Frankly, I think the sexual violence, or the sexual frustration, is just one aspect of frustration as a whole, for men in particular. Particularly young men who can't find jobs, who are living in authoritarian systems, not just at the level of the family with the patriarch, but also at the level of the state. And these power structures put enormous pressure on men, and we know from studies elsewhere in the world that when you put men under pressure, they behave badly, and the next people down the line in a patriarchal hierarchy are women. And so I think it's right that there's an element. The sex is just one channel of the multiple forms of political, economic, and other social frustration that are spilling over into violence in the private domain and also in the public space.
Dr. Ghanem, do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with the speaker. Absolutely. It's reinforcing, the frustration on the national level, because the authoritarian regime and few elites dominating politics and economics, and very little left for men who are supposed to be culturally dominant in society, but they find this is restricted to only few men, while the rest of the men have to be content with domesticity to exercise their exaggerated male ego. And that's why we have violence in domestic life, because that's the only domain that is not really challenged by the authoritarian state. And that's why also the family laws are still unreformed in the Middle East and still failing to ensure basic human rights for all citizens.
And Dr. Ghanem, Shireen Al-Feki at this moment.
I think it's very interesting what Dr. Ghanem is speaking of, and it also picks up on a point that Valeria made, because women and their sexuality, their bodies, again, it's not a personal matter. Your virginity as a woman is not a private concern, it's a family affair. And this connects to what Dr. Ghanem has just said, because where is a man's honor? Honor remains important in Arab culture, but how can you exercise it as a man today? It tends to now devolve to the domestic space and then the control of women. And so it's a very, very complex dynamic. But the key to it is, in changing this dynamic, is also we need to absolutely work with women and girls to empower them, but we also now need to bring men into the equation to think about how they are responding to this changing world around them and how we can effectively bring them to the table as equal partners, not just individuals who expect to be served.
Right. Valeria, do you
I totally agree. I think it's really a reinforcing relationship. So like the economic and political frustration led to an increase in domestic violence. This is not just in the Middle East. It's been seen studying in like many areas of conflict. And again, an increase in domestic violence then leads to a general acceptance for violence in society. And I totally agree with Shireen that we really need to engage to empower like young girls and young women, but also engage men in this, because otherwise we will not be able to bring any change.
Dr. Ghanem, do you have any ideas of how men can be engaged in this?
Well, I agree with the speakers that this is not only a task for women. This is a joint task for men and women, and that's why I mean this the role of men. There is even in feminist literature there is an essentialization of men and the violence of men. Here it's better to talk about structure, which is oppressive, and both men and women are victimized and affected by the same structure. And therefore, I mean, changing the situation is the task for men and women, and should have cooperation on this instead of being in a conflicting position. So I think men and women are really responsible for changing the situation. Particularly, I mean, men have more status and rights, but they are also affected and to a large extent by the social and cultural and political and economic arrangement, the whole package. They are really not finding, they do not achieve the full realization of their personalities and ambition, and they are. It's in their interest to change the situation. It's not only for women.
And Dr. Ghanem, Shireen has recently been doing a study about male sexuality as well. I'd love to know about your findings on this.
Yes, so picking up on both our speakers, it's very interesting. In the Arab region, gender has distinctly female features. So if one looks at the money and the attention that is brought to these questions, whether it's in terms of reforming national laws or it's donor projects, policy making, etc., it's focused on women and girls. As we said, there's very little on men and boys. We actually know very little about the lives of men and boys, although they are the pillars of our patriarchies. And so if you really want to engage men and boys in questions of gender equality in and out of the bedroom, you need to understand what is happening in their lives. And so I am part of an NGO called Promundo, and under the aegis of UN Women and funded by the Swedish International Development Agency, we are undertaking a 4-country study of what it is to be a man in the modern Middle East. We are interviewing more than 9,000 men and women about all aspects of life, what it's been like for men as children, for instance, how they interact with their wives in terms of domestic affairs, what is happening in terms of their sexual health, for example, how they are interacting with their own children, what do they think about some of the norms we have around the roles of men and women. It's a very, very full picture of how men see themselves and how they see the changing roles of men and women in Arab society. And it's the first time it's a study of this magnitude and this scope has ever been done. And it's really important to have this data. It's important for us in the Arab region to start to build momentum to change some of the, for example, prejudicial or discriminatory personal status laws that both our speakers have mentioned. But it's also important for the world beyond the Arab region. Because of course we have seen a discourse around Arab men, and in particular Arab men's sexuality in Europe over the last 6 months, which has been extremely unhelpful. In the wake of the sexual assaults in Cologne on New Year's Eve, for instance, there has been a groundswell of commentary, particularly from the right wing, which stereotypes all Arab men as effectively sexual predators who are going to wreak havoc in the cities of the West. And this is a gross generalization, but unfortunately there's no data. There's very little fact to try to combat the rhetoric. We have a lot of heat and not very much light. And hopefully this study will provide some of that illumination to have a more nuanced discussion about Arab men and the challenges they face in sexual life, in personal life, and in public life.
Dr. Ghanem, you've stated that women are complicit in gender violence in the Middle East. Can you explain this?
Yes, of course. I mean, it all depends on what definition we use for gender violence. If we are talking about physical violence, then obviously this is violence dominated by men. But if we go for a broader and more inclusive definition, where women, men and women are related, men and women are involved and related to social structure in which both men and women are affected and victimized by it, then we are talking about violence, structural violence in relation to personal violence, representing the agency of both men and women, even though to different degrees and level. So in addition to physical violence, there is psychological violence, verbal, deliberate, unconscious, overt, hidden, direct, indirect, cultural, structural, all sorts of violence. Now, I mean, the Orientalist vision of women in the Middle East, that they are powerless, but this is not true. They are not entirely powerless because living in a harsh social condition demonstrate that women in the Middle East are powerful and demonstrate agency and power.
Dr. Ghanem,
if we reach to this point and we recognize that women demonstrate power and they have power, and we know that power and violence are strongly interlinked, then it would be a more natural conclusion to say that this power of female power is also leading to violence. So it doesn't make sense to say women in the Middle East are not really powerless, but they don't contribute into violence. I mean, it doesn't make sense here, logical sense. I mean, if they are powerful, if they have power, a certain level of power, not necessarily equal to men, that's absolutely not the case, but if they have power, then they are also contributing to violence.
Dr. Ghanem, on that point, I think Shireen wants to come in.
Again, it's not just men who uphold the patriarchies across the Arab region. Women also buy into this, and they have very patriarchal attitudes and practices. So, for example, if one looks at female genital mutilation, female circumcision, your report talked about 90% of ever married Egyptian women having been circumcised. Well, within the household, who is making the decision whether a girl is circumcised or not? The men are not really part of the equation. It's the mother and the grandmother who are making this decision. It's exactly what Dr. Ghanem said. I mean, women have power in the domestic space. And we have to ask ourselves, if men are discriminatory towards women, if they're prejudiced towards women, if they treat women as lesser beings, where do they get these ideas? In many households, for instance, if one looks at how boys and girls are raised, mothers will treat their children of different sexes very differently. So the boys are not expected to do any household chores. The boys can roam the world on the internet. The boys can go out, no problem. And yet it's the girls who are expected to serve the boys. It's the girls who have their every movement on the internet monitored by the family. And it's the girls whose mobility, their physical mobility, is also restricted. Patriarchy and these gender inequitable attitudes, they start in the home. They're often instilled by mothers themselves, and then these attitudes continue on into school, into the workplace, and into marriage. So if we want to change these patriarchal structures, we also have to look at the benefit that some women do derive from them and actually change their perspective as well.
Dr. Ghanem, a final point on anything we've heard there?
I totally agree with Shireen. I wanted to say that just to give examples of the contribution of women to violence, there are documented role of the mothers in the, for instance, honor killing and also female genital mutilation, as Shireen said. Senior females are instrumental in controlling and policing younger females. The gossip culture, which is dominated by women, is a control system in society, controlling the younger women. Mothers play a role in socializing their children with discriminatory social value, as Shireen said. And also, don't forget the role of the mother-in-law in family conflict and control. This is very violent role for the mother-in-law. Many women participate in terrorism. Now, these are new phenomena as well. Many women internalize patriarchal values and police themselves and participate in this violence and control of themselves. And also, there is another point that, of course, there is power and agency for women in getting around patriarchal structure, and they gain some achievement, and they are content with these achievements. For instance, instead of challenging the virginity cult, they participate in all sexual activities, and then they go for this artificial virginity and all this. There is a point here that the little gain in power does not lead to more national power for women. And the statistics and the reality of women, the life of women in the Middle East is really gloomy and terrible compared to any other region in the world. When it comes to their participation in the economy, the lowest labor force participation.
Dr. Ghanem, Dr. Ghanem, I'm sorry, we have to leave you there. But thank you so much for your time for today. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks.
Valeria, I know you've been in Iraq and working with Yazidi women and children and the enslavement and the treatment of ISIS. I'd love to know a bit more about your field work.
Yeah, I was recently for 3 months in northern Iraq conducting a survey among the displaced Yazidi population from Sinjar. And we interview a random sample of over 1,000 households, asking information about any family members who was killed or kidnapped by ISIS. And we also collected information about the health status of those who survived the ISIS attack. The women who escaped ISIS captivity really gave us harrowing accounts of the abuses they suffered, including torture and sex slavery. In many cases, entire families were captured together and by ISIS militants, and then once in captivity, they were separated and forcibly transferred to different locations in ISIS-controlled territories. We had like accounts of like girls as young as 6 that were like separated from their mothers and either sold or gifted to ISIS fighters. And on the other hand, women who, older women were in some cases killed simply because they were not considered suitable to be sold as sex slaves.
Just killed like that. Shireen, do you feel a disproportionate amount of attention is being focused on the ISIS treatment of women and children in the media?
Disproportionate to what?
To other groups and to other forms of violence in the Middle East, just to stir up hatred within the West? Because there is that argument, people are saying this, and I've heard this.
I think it is frankly, it is unprecedented in modern times. The level of sexual violence that the ISIS fighters are using. It's very interesting. They understand very well the connection between sex and power. They use sex and sexual exploitation because it really has a 1-2 punch. By sexually abusing and exploiting women, you are not just affecting the women, you are also touching the men, because the men are considered to be guardians of the women. So you are effectively also demonstrating, your women, we have used them sexually, they are worthless, but also you as men, you could not protect them. But what's very interesting, it's not just ISIS which uses sex as a form of control. We can see this in many governments across the region. If one thinks of, for instance, the forced virginity testing that one saw used by the transitional government in Egypt, in which female protesters were effectively subjected to forced virginity testing. It is a form of humiliation. It is a form of intimidation. It is a very effective tool of control, according to the authorities of the day. If one looks at the arrests of LGBT individuals, again, sexuality becomes this really powerful tool of political control. So I think ISIS represents an extreme instance of sex and power, but sadly it's not the only one sees in the region, and also if one looks around the world. None of what we're talking about, these taboos, the regulation, the political control, sadly none of it is unique to the Arab region. One finds it around the world.
Okay, well, now joining us over Skype in London is Rothna Begum, researcher on the Middle East and North Africa women's rights at Human Rights Watch. Rothna, it's been 2 years on since the abduction of Yazidi women and children. Can you tell us about what is happening now and what support they're receiving?
Absolutely. We have been documenting the organized rape and sexual slavery of Yazidi women and girls by ISIS. But we have also been looking at the response by the Iraqi Kurdistan government, who have been hosting and taking care of women and girls who have been displaced or have escaped to their provinces. In this regard, we noticed in particular that Yazidi women and girls were particularly in need of psychosocial care, of which they have found it to be scarce. Now, we conducted this research last year and again this year. Last year, the access to psychosocial care was very little. Over the past year, this has increased, but there still seems to be issues around general capacity of providing adequate ongoing counseling. So we have situations where there are some organizations providing what's considered to be basic first aid psychosocial care, or one-off psychosocial counseling, but not ongoing long-term trauma counseling, which is what women and girls who have suffered incredible amounts of harm to them need. And we also found that the issues around not just the capacity, but also their access as well. So women and girls who are living in camps a little bit too far away from such services, or because of stigma or confusion about such services, they're not able to access it either.
And members of the Yazidi community did voice concerns that returning women should be treated as victims and be accepted back into the community. Is this the case?
Initially, when women and girls were abducted and were suffering such terrible circumstances, everyone had concerns that they would be rejected by their own community. We've seen this time and time again in conflicts across the world, where families abandon their daughters, where husbands abandon their wives who return to them after being raped in conflict. So this was a valid concern for the Yazidi community, as it is for any other community. But what we found was that the Yazidi community did make some steps to try and accept those who had returned. Their religious leader, Sheikh Baba, he had issued an edict that basically said that they would welcome those who had returned and they would still consider them to be Yazidis. So we have seen Yazidi women and girls who have returned go through a sort of cleansing process. They go to their religious shrine. They are able to then sort of cleanse themselves, religiously speaking, of what had happened to them in order to be accepted back into the community. However, when we talk about this issue, it's a much broader issue of stigma. So even if there has been this religious edict, there is still a broader sense that this is a very stigmatized and taboo issue. So there are still women and girls who are not coming forward that may have escaped, and families who are not also coming forward to say that their escaped relatives have returned to them. Because again, the part of the problem is not just the fact that they wouldn't be accepted immediately, but the question is more about what happens to them in the long term. Can they marry again? Who will marry them, having been subjected to such terrible violence?
And Rothna, I wanted to bring in Valeria here. Did you also find similar?
Yes, totally. I was positively surprised by that, because the Yazidis are known to be a relatively traditional and close community. Marriage outside with members of non-members of the group are traditionally not allowed. So, but in this case, probably exactly because of the large number of women who were abducted and managed to escape, they were in general accepted back by their families. But I also agree that there is a serious problem of shame and social stigma. So when these women come back, there have been even cases of obviously many cases of women who committed suicide when in captivities, but also women who continue to suffer, even those who were lucky enough to escape. They find it difficult to go back to their normal life. We must remember these are women who suffer from really extreme form of sexual violence.
What's interesting is, again, as I say, this is sadly not a uniquely Arab phenomenon. The group I mentioned, Promonda, where we work on studying Arab men, elsewhere in the world where we have done these studies, the work has also continued into community projects. And one very interesting project of relevance to the Yazidi situation is in Democratic Republic of Congo, which was labeled the rape capital of the world, the worst place to be a woman because of the whole scale use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Again, very much the same problems, the difficulty of having women to be accepted back into their families, and the key point that Rothna made, can they marry? And the key to that is engaging with men. And so there has been some very interesting work, it takes place over a long period of time, over years, to help men adjust to this situation and to also overcome their sense that they have failed. That they as men were responsible for protecting their women. They could not. This is not just a problem for them. This is a problem for the women. This is a problem for them as well. So there are good examples elsewhere in the world of how one can come to grips with this human tragedy of unfathomable proportions. So it's bleak, but it's not a hopeless situation.
Absolutely. I think it's totally true. The Yazidi community is traumatized as a whole. Is it really traumatized? Not only the women who experienced the sexual violence, but also the men who felt they were unable to protect their women. And we found we visited all the Yazidi camps, and we found still a high prevalence of mental health problems, not only among the women, but also in some cases among men. And unfortunately, the psychosocial supports that these people were able to receive were not adequate in most cases.
Rothna, with abortions being illegal in Iraq, Human Rights Watch is amongst the groups campaigning to have terminations made legal for rape victims. Can you tell us whether any progress is being made on this front?
Unfortunately, abortion continues to be illegal in Iraq. There was some discussion, at least in the Kurdistan parliament, about whether they should legalize this in the cases of rape. This hasn't really moved forward as much as we would like. We know that there have been, abortions being carried out that have been, overlooked, or a sort of a blind eye being given to situations like that, where it has been Yazidi rape victims who have actually come forward for such abortions. But these are sort of clandestine. They're not happening officially speaking. The government themselves are not allowing this to sort of take place. And so we've been calling on the government to really make this available for victims who are seeking abortions. We've also been sort of speaking to the government about ensuring that they are providing care and services for children born of rape. So one of the big issues was that, this happened since August 2014 now. So when we went, it was early 2015, and by then, there were some who were pregnant, maybe could have abortions, but none of them would have had children at that point. But a year on now, there have been obviously some cases of women who have had children born as a result of rape. And we were very concerned that these children would not be accepted in the community, or, women would need to have that choice whether they want to keep them, whether they don't want to keep them, what would happen with their names. There's a whole series of scenarios that occurs in such situations. And what we wanted was that the government should have a plan to deal with all such situations, ensuring the best interest of the child, but also ensuring that the woman has as much choice in it as possible. The government has taken some steps, so we know that they've said that there have been about 3 cases, and in those situations, the women gave up the children and they've made adequate, services available for those children. But we still think that there needs to be a holistic plan, including both abortion services as well as children who are actually born as a result of rape.
Rothna, I'd like to bring in Shireen. You had a point there.
Yes, Rothna has raised a really interesting point here about also the role of religion, which we have sort of touched on a little bit in this discussion. But again, in the case of the Yazidi population, what has been a very positive move has been the edicts, as mentioned, from their religious leaders, urging the community to accept these women. And what is ironic about our situation today, particularly in an Islamic context, is Islam is now seen as very closed and buttoned up around sex. And yet, historically, as your introductory report showed, we have a long history as Arabs and as Muslims of being comfortable in our sexual skin. Now, the difficulty about this closing down in Islam with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism is reflected in the laws. As Rothna just mentioned, the very restrictive abortion laws. And yet, where there is political will, you can find an Islamic way. So I give you a particular example in the case of abortion. So in Morocco, last year, King Mohammed VI said that we must open our abortion laws. They are quite restrictive, and now they are largely, terminations are permitted in the case of a danger to a woman's health or life. We need to find a way, because we have a problem. We have we have children being born out of wedlock. We have a thriving illegal abortion business, more than 600 illegal terminations a day. Something must be done. And so what is interesting is that in the groups that he assembled nationally to come up with a new plan and recommend a new law, there were also religious figures. And religious leaders who had said for a very long time, absolutely not, abortion cannot be permitted. They were following one particular school of Islamic jurisprudence. Well, suddenly we are now going to look at other schools of Islamic jurisprudence which do allow abortion on a much wider grounds. And as a consequence of this, the law has been opened in Morocco. Not to the full extent of abortion on demand, but certainly it is progress. So the important point here, and Rothna has raised it and Valeria has also touched on it, that there is flexibility in Islam if the political leadership chooses to use it. And one hopes that with the advocacy of Rothna and her colleagues and others, that one will see that pragmatism rediscovered and redeployed in the case of the Yazidis and other Iraqis.
And picking up on that flexibility point, Rothna, if governments in the Middle East, such as Morocco, tell NGOs to leave and stop meddling with their domestic affairs, how are NGOs such as Human Rights Watch getting round this problem to combat gender violence?
So I conducted research on domestic violence in Morocco before the Moroccan government decided that they no longer wanted Human Rights Watch to be conducting research there. So this is a problem because on issues like domestic violence, we want the government to engage with us. We want the government to explain what it is that they're doing in order to help prevent such violence taking place, but also steps that they're taking to protect women. And we also are completely, taking into account those steps that they are taking, and want to sort of work with them in that regard. Since the Moroccan government has sort of taken this step forward, we do have a problem now that they're no longer speaking to us in the same way as maybe they were before. So in this regard, we've sort of taken to still writing to them, still trying to sort of engage with them in that communication, but also look into other forms. So utilizing the media, and particularly the social media, to get other concerned parties to liaise with the government to raise the same issues that we're raising. This is not an issue that we as Human Rights Watch just care about. This is an issue that Moroccans themselves want to change, that Moroccan women have been fighting for decades now in trying to get a violence against women legislation that is strong, that prevents domestic violence, protects women, and prosecutes their abusers. So in this regard, we're seeing that the Moroccan government is taking some steps because they felt that pressure coming both from Human Rights Watch but also from their own society as a result of this push. And they did adopt, the Council of Government, which is the cabinet in Morocco, did adopt the draft legislation on violence against women. And it's currently before Parliament. Now, the new revised version is still quite poor. We still consider it to be not adequate, and it doesn't provide for duties of the police and the prosecutors to actually address domestic violence. And so, we're still calling on this law to be reformed in a way that accords with international standards, and as such, would actually protect women. If this is then passed, Morocco would, if they passed it in line with international standards, they could become a model for the rest of the region, which is, as a whole, the region is lagging behind in protecting women from domestic violence.
Rothna, thank you very much for being with us today. That was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, lots of points there. My head's spinning. But that was an interesting point on the society being a factor, or being able to push government to change, a pressure from society. So there could be movement there.
Well, there is movement. And again, this impression that we in the Arab region are somehow hopeless and helpless when it comes to matters of sexuality is mistaken, quite frankly. Now, we have civil society groups, we have NGOs across the region tackling the most difficult subjects. For example, in Morocco, very strong, homegrown groups trying to find a place for unwed mothers in society, help them to keep their kids, find a place to live, find a job, and reconcile with their families. We have fantastic NGOs working amongst Palestinian communities in Israel and now also in the West Bank, trying to get sexuality education into schools. We have NGOs in Tunisia and Lebanon who are tackling the incendiary topic of homosexuality. How can we find a place for LGBT people in our societies? So we do have homegrown movements. Now, they're very small. They're often under enormous pressure from government. There are all sorts of problems if they receive foreign funding, but they go on. And the key to their success and the key to their ability to shift policy ever so slightly is the fact that they are not trying for revolutionary change. They are not trying for a bold confrontation that will overthrow the system. Clearly, that did not work very well for us in 2011 in Tahrir Square and elsewhere. They are moving towards what I would call a sexual evolution, a very gradual process of negotiation, because they understand that this is the way that one gets lasting change in the region.
Valeria, you've actually researched in quite a bit of detail the rise in early marriage and childbearing among young girls in Iraq and Syria, not just ISIS-controlled territories. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a growing issue that we see both in Iraq and Syria since the start of the war in these countries. There have been an increased prevalence of early marriage among young girls. The rate of early marriage among boys is much lower, which suggests that these girls are married off to much older men. Well, the reason behind this increase in early marriages are several. Some families consider this the best way to protect their daughters, especially in contexts like refugee camps. The general insecurity and the perceived risk of sexual harassment are often mentioned as a reason to marry off their daughters at a young age. And obviously early marriage is also a way to alleviate poverty by easing pressure on the family resources. This is worrisome because we know that girls that get married at a very young age tend to have a lower status in their home. They are less able to influence decisions about their own life, and they're also at higher risk of experiencing domestic violence. And these women, then these young girls, tend to get pregnant when they are not fully physically and mentally prepared, obviously, and they face higher risk of maternal mortality and morbidity, and also poorer health outcome for their children.
I need to point out, though, that again, the extreme situation that these poor women and girls find themselves in, and yet, if one looks elsewhere in the Arab region, there actually has been really palpable progress on dealing with early marriage. So we have seen several countries which have now introduced laws which set the legal age of marriage for men and women at 18, for instance. And in Egypt, for example, one has seen a significant decline in the rate of marriage under the age of 18 over the last 10 to 15 years, from, let's say, 30% of women down to perhaps 20% now. So there is progress. Of course, it's very difficult, no matter what the law, anything to do with sex, quite frankly, no matter what the law says, it really doesn't have too much impact on what people actually do. So if the families are under pressure, then of course the law, whether you have it or not, they will do what they think they have to do. So there's a real educational element at both levels, changing the law, but also changing the mindsets and the practices on the ground. But in many places in the Arab region, there has been notable progress on this front.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with the fact that there have been really a lot of progress in many other Arab countries in terms of reducing early marriage. I also wanted to make a point though about the legal age for marriage. In some cases, this risk of putting these young girls in an even more vulnerable situation, because some of these marriages are not legally registered because the girls are underage, which means that these girls are virtually no rights in case their husband decides to leave them.
Yes. Absolutely, which points to the fact that a good law is a necessary but insufficient tool of control and of changing and creating an environment of human rights, which are recognized not just on paper, but also in practice.
Now I'd like to welcome over the phone Dr. Etemad Muhana Matar, Assistant Professorial Research Fellow at LSE's Middle East Centre in London. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Matar. There is a much touted opinion that Arab women are oppressed. Do you agree with this?
Yes, of course. I mean, there are millions of Arab women who are oppressed, but we have also not to deny that there are millions of Arab men are oppressed. So, understanding the position of oppressed Arab women has to be presented within the context of oppression against Arabs in general, based on several factors, not only gender. We have to consider that both Arab men and women, although differently, are oppressed by authoritarian regimes, by corruption, by the Israeli occupation, like in the case of Palestine, by the most important factor at the current days is the continuous conflict and war that can be stopped by the international community and avoid the suffering of men and women and millions of men and women in the Arab world. So yes, women in the Arab countries are oppressed, and one factor of their oppression is patriarchal structure and culture. But patriarchy within the context of deprivation and vulnerability of the majority of population has to be taken considerably or understood in a realistic way that is actually used as the only source for survival, socioeconomic survival, and for both men and women and families to feel secure and to manage with the consequences of war. So this is how we have to see patriarchy, as an empowering and disempowering related to the particular context that women live in. And I give you an example of Palestinian women during the humanitarian crisis and the livelihood crisis that they lived in for decades now. Women do not or reject the humanitarian support provided by the international community that asks them to go out and to act as primary provider, working outside home, getting involved in politics, getting involved in development, because this humanitarian intervention or development intervention is associated with masculinity crisis with their men, husbands, who are unemployed, jobless, lost their sense of masculinity. So what women decide to do or choose to act their gender in a way to protect their men from being degraded and humiliated by staying at home and doing nothing. This is the context that I'm talking about that has to be considered when we talk about women's oppression in Arab countries, and trying to avoid this Western liberal feminist discourse that's always looking at women's oppression from a singular perspective, like Arab women are oppressed by Arab men, regardless of the actual forms of oppression that men themselves suffer from.
Very much so, and there is an opinion that demonizes men. You hear this a lot, demonizing them as the eternal tormentors. What would you say to that?
Actually, this demonizing men or Arab men or Muslim men has become a big issue, a very debatable issue. I'm not like supporting those women who always refer everything to imperialism or colonialism or post-colonialism. But actually, liberal feminists at the current days, especially the war against ISIS, trying always to present men, Muslim Arab men as monsters, and women are always victim and passive recipient of certain ideologies or certain form of patriarchy, ignoring the facts and the evidence presented in so many reports and literatures that it's basically men trying to resist against their alienation, their oppression by the regimes, by the authoritarian and corrupted regimes, and women decide to support men's different forms of resistance against corruption. So it's actually a mutual understanding of oppression from a wider perspective rather than from a gender perspective that makes so many Arab Muslim women to, for example, decide to get involved in Islamist groups. So we have to take into consideration why, for example, Arab women freely and willingly decide to get involved with the groups that adopt a patriarchal ideology. A patriarchal ideology, from their point of view, is not oppressive against them. It's rather giving them a sense of feeling of dignity or human dignity and resistance against the actual colonial, let's say, forces that killing and bombing children and women in different parts of the Arab world, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. So yeah, we have to avoid presenting men as monsters, as torturing Arab women. We have to look at Arab men within the context and taking into consideration that they are Arab men who representing authoritarian regimes that, for example, putting human rights activists, male and female activists, in prison and do not give them the right to express their freedom of conscience or their political views in Egypt, for example. There are millions of Muslim Arab women and men in Egypt. They work together to resist against the authoritarian regime in Egypt and the violation of their human rights without mentioning or highlighting the issue of gender or patriarchy.
Dr.
So
Mata,
we need also to look at women's struggle in terms of particular context of oppression that they experience in their own life.
and Dr. Mata, on that point, I'd like to bring in Shireen.
No, I absolutely agree with Dr. Mata's points, and it's picking up on a number of the topics that we've discussed in this interview. The idea, this demonization of Arab men, it falls into these well-worn stereotypes. It's it's not just, again, not unique to the Arab region. If one looks throughout history, one finds in conflicts with one group pitted against the other, often it's the other's men, and particularly the other's men's sexuality, which become the point of criticism, the point of focus. Somehow we are fighting this battle because those men are a danger not only to their own women, but to our women as well. And again, it's with more research and more engagement with men on the ground, and more speaking out and pointing out, just as Dr. Matar and Valeria and Dr. Ghanem have pointed out, that again, it's not just women who are on the receiving end of oppression in countries across our region. There are also men who are suffering. By presenting this broader contextual argument, I think that is our way forward.
And Dr. Mata, did the Arab Spring change anything in terms of improvements for women's sexual freedom, in your opinion?
Okay, first of all, I don't like to use this term sexual freedom. As long as Arab women and non-Arab women have a control over their body, whether to cover it or to reveal their body, it's up to them to decide how to deal with their sexuality. But yes, the Arab uprising have made a fundamental change, actually, on women, particularly young generation of women. From my research experience in Tunisia and Palestine, in Morocco, and partially in Yemen, young women, young Arab women become really critical of the actual system and critical of the politics of their own countries. And that is a fundamental change. And as a Palestinian woman who experience how to be critical of politics, and try to link it with how, for example, young Tunisian women, learn from the revolution, learn from the uprisings, how to criticize the political system and how to develop their skills to maneuver with it. Whether to decide to support this particular political party or another, or this particular group or another. There are a large number of Salafi women, for example, ultra-conservative Islamist women in Tunisia decided within a short period of time during the political crisis in Tunisia in 2013-14 to shift from being Salafis to become more supportive of Muslim Brother of a Nahda party, or leaving a Nahda party to support nationalist parties. This critical agency of women actually developed through the uprising and the experience of getting involved in the spontaneous popular demonstrations. Another aspect of change is young generation of women decided to distance themselves from elitist youth, elitist political, elitist feminist organization, and to initiate their own groups. Mostly informal initiatives. They develop these initiatives in their own communities and try to provide services, basic services, including education, to most vulnerable groups who are actually not considered sufficiently by formal organizations that have enough resources or money. This is one of the dilemmas of NGOs work in most Arab countries, that till now they are not really connected to the actual needs of people living in poor neighborhoods and marginalized areas. Yes, this is a fundamental change.
Right. Well, Dr. Mehta, that's all we have time for, unfortunately, but thank you so much for your participation today.
My pleasure. Okay, bye. Thank you.
Just one final question to you both. What is the best way to help evolve cultural attitudes? Because a government can change overnight, and religion can as well, but what's the best way forward, in your opinion?
Well, I think this is definitely not easy. It's require really gradual changes that should come from the civil society, like women, as we were saying, women and men together. And from my personal experience working in conflict-affected countries, I must say that really I think that also the restoration of peace is probably a crucial prerequisite for any serious change, happening.
And Shireen?
Picking up on Valeria's point, I think it's very important that people start asking the hard questions. So we have 3 red lines in the Arab region. These are the topics that you're not supposed to challenge in word or deed. One of them is politics. And that line has been well and truly crossed since 2011, although we have taken many steps back since then. The second red line is religion. And one has seen with the rise and fall of Islamic fundamentalist groups in a number of our countries, and with the atrocities committed by ISIS, people are asking very hard questions now of who speaks in the name of Islam. What is the role of Islam in public life? That third red line is sex, and I think that the work that all of your speakers, guests today are doing are shedding light on that and providing, I hope, the foundation for people across the region to ask those same hard questions of the taboos and the received wisdoms in sexual life, and to also have the courage that when those on the other side, the conservative forces say that no, we cannot speak about these things, we cannot talk about sex as a pleasure, for example. We can only present it as a problem that needs to be solved, that they have the information, and that they have the courage, and that they have the opportunity to push back and say, no, that is not true. To be true to our heritage as Arabs and Muslims is to talk about these taboo subjects. Our forefathers did it, and we need to find a way to start a conversation that makes sense for our time.
Right, thank you. Well, that's all we have time for today. As ever, I'm very grateful to all my guests on the programme, Dr. David Ghanem, Rotna Begum, Dr. Aitmad Mohana Mata, and of course my studio guests, Shireen Elfeki and Dr. Valeria Chetorelli. Thank you so much. Until next time, goodbye.